was a great introduction. The story, the pitch, everything. So, obviously, the more you think about this, the more complicated and ramified and many-branched and difficult the answer becomes, since every answer I think that you come up with suggests other possibilities too. And when people ask what the meaning of life is, I think that their first impulse is they want to know the meaning of life because they want to be happy. But at least in Judaism, happiness isn't the meaning of life. Happiness is a part of life, but it's not the meaning of life. And by the way, it's not in the American tradition either, right? The pursuit of happiness is part of the meaning of life, but not necessarily happiness. And I want us to keep that as the background hum. That is, this is not a lecture. I would be interested to give a lecture sometime about how to be happy, but this isn't it. And I don't want to suggest that what I'm giving you are techniques to make your life better. They're explorations in what gives life meaning. And those aren't necessarily the same thing. The easy out to this would be to say, in Judaism, what gives your life meaning is to do what God wants. But that is such a broad answer as to mean nothing. And even if you say to do the 613 mitzvot, which, by the way, you can't do, you're aware of that, because once the temple is destroyed, most of the mitzvot go out the window. Even that is subject to widely varying interpretations, and after all, different mitzvot compete with one another. And you can't do them all at the same time, or in the same order, or with the same priority. And so you have to wonder what mitzvah is the mitzvah that gives life meaning more than the other ones. So I started just a few minutes ago to write down whether life meaning can be consistent for the following people. And I just sketched a few that I thought of you could add. A tribesman who has to search for food, a mathematician, a musician, a builder, a soldier, a mother, a medical aid worker, a scholar, a preschool teacher, an artist, an engineer, and a poet. If you ask yourself, if you say, for example, well, what ties them all together is love, again, you've made love so broad as to make it basically meaningless. So if I tell you, as many people did when I asked them what's the meaning of life is love, well, yes, you can fold your tent on that and go home. But I don't think anybody's learned anything by saying the meaning of life is love. And not only that, but since I want to subject this to some critical pressure before I propose my own meanings, one of the things that I'm always aware of is when people at the end of their life say, I regret that I didn't spend more time with my children, that it's not necessarily true that what you regret at the end of your life has to have more weight in your life's estimation than what you did in the middle of your life. Because if you took that same guy and you made him 35 again, would he live differently? I don't know. So yes, I understand why lying on your deathbed and looking at your children, you feel regret that you didn't spend more time with them, and you're inclined to think, that was the meaning of life and I just missed it. But we've all heard this story, and yet people go on doing things that they are told they're going to regret later. Why? Obviously, they must find a meaning in it now that they may not find later, but they do now. So one of the things I want to do is get rid of the easy answers. Because if you're here to hear all of life is about love and nobody really cares, nobody puts on their tombstone how, what their yearly earnings was, yes, rabbis give that sermon, but I'm not sure how helpful that is. I mean, I remember to be irreverent about something I shouldn't be irreverent about, especially when I'm being taped. But I remember I remember at 9/11, there were some very moving testimonies about the fact that the last things that people said into their cell phones were, "I love you." But then I thought, what were they going to say? Sell short? Think about it for a minute. I mean, you were saying something to the person that you know loves you, and you're going to die. Of course you would say that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that message is the meaning of your life. It was surely the meaning of that moment. It was surely crucial for your life. But does it trump everything else you cared about all along the way that wasn't that? I'm not saying it does, but it's at least worth thinking about if we're really going to think about the meaning of life and you didn't come here to just hear, it's love and we should care about each other, thank you and good night. So once you put it in that perspective, what I started to think about the meaning of life was that it's a bad question. That you should say, what are the meanings of life? And that the attempt to give life a single meaning itself is a mistake and un-Jewish in a way. Because in Judaism, the only thing that has a perfect unity is God. Everything else is fragmented, including the human heart. And if you prescribe a meaning to life, you will find people who have lived interesting, rich, full lives, and they didn't actually conform to that meaning. So what are you going to say about that? It reminds me of the story of Isaac Stern, who was a concert violinist. And a woman came up to him and said, "You know, Mr. Stern, I would do anything to play the way you play." And he said, "Really? Would you give 10 hours a day for 20 years? Because that's what I did." Now, I don't know Isaac Stern's life story, but I am sure that for some professional musicians, if you ask them the meaning of your life, they would say the music. Now, you might not want to be married to such a person, but does that mean they were wrong? Could you say to them, no, the meaning of life is love, and you were mistaken about the music. That was nice, but it wasn't the meaning. I think that that's probably a mistake. That in fact, our attempt to force one meaning is a sort of disservice to the variety of God's creation. Yes, there are certain things that human beings all need, and I'm going to get to those. I mean, apart from the obvious, like warmth and shelter and food. But I really do believe that there are differently constituted natures who find meaning in different things. And one of the ways that I've come to believe that is by my greatest study of human nature, which is eulogies. You want to know the meaning of life? Listen to enough families talk about people on their death. And I want to tell you 3 things that I have learned about that. The first is that everybody is many people. Because the person that you hear from one child even is not the person that you hear from the other child. And certainly not the person that you hear from the best friend, or from the spouse, or from the co-workers. And you start to realize that, again, putting somebody in a straitjacket of, this was a kind, good man, may be the appropriate strategy for the eulogy, but is actually doing some surgery on the human soul. Second, most people live where they live. Not everyone, but most people, that is, their intimate connections are, in fact, the most important things in their lives. I think that's, if you're going to make a generalization about human beings, I would say most people will say her family came first. And that makes sense for all of us because love, proximity, frequency, all those things are concentrated in the family. So I think it's very clearly that has to be a big piece of the meaning, are your most intimate connections. So piece number 1 is your many people. Piece number 2 is your most intimate connections. But here's the third piece that is, I think, sometimes not given sufficient attention or credit, which is that what people do in the world is deeply meaningful to them. And by that I mean what we sometimes derisively call career. Oh, that was just his career. But what you do in your life, whether it's charity work or career or whatever it is, that's a big part and piece of who you are and shouldn't be cut out from the meaning of your life. And we tend to do that. Yes, he was a lawyer, but the meaning of his life was his family. Well, he spent 10 hours a day in the office for 40 years. How can you say that wasn't part of the meaning of his life? And one of the reasons we do that is most work tends to be so intricate that people who aren't in the office don't actually know what you did. So what happens is you spend hours and hours and hours doing something, and you come home and someone says, like you say to a kid, "How was school today?" And they go, "Fine." Right? Because otherwise, you don't live in that village. You don't know all the characters. You don't know the people. I say that about the synagogue all the time when people ask me how the synagogue is. I said, synagogue is great, but it's like a village. If you live in the village, so there are a million stories in the village. But if you're outside the village, to say, this happened, doesn't mean anything. But that's a big part of the meaning of people's lives, are those connections that they have in their workspaces too. And remember that when you talk about Shabbat, you remember what God says on the seventh day? He says, 6 days you shall work, and on the seventh day you rest. And everybody concentrates on the seventh day, but it also means the other 6 days you're supposed to be doing something. So it can't be that the meaning of the tradition is only the seventh day and not the other 6. Now let me make one other disclaimer. The other thing I could have gone, the other strategy that was open to me was I could say the meaning of this life is what you get in the next life. Very good old Jewish strategy. In fact, it even says in Pirkei Avot, this life is like a prosdor, which is like a hallway to the world to come, to Olam Haba. I am, for the purposes of this lecture, I'm going to concentrate on this. I'm going to do what Thoreau said when someone asked him about the next world when he was dying. He said, one world at a time. Right? So I'm just going to focus on this one. I'm going to leave that one to whatever it may be. And I want to say one other thing, which is a division that as I thought about this, I kept coming back to it again and again and again. Which is, one of the meanings of life is obviously the state of your soul. But one of the ways of thinking about the meaning of life is the state of the world. And by this I mean, I'm going to get in trouble for this most likely, but one of the things that people say all the time that I think is almost obviously untrue. You can't love other people if you don't love yourself. I think that's just not true. I think there are a lot of people, a lot of parents, for example, who didn't like themselves, didn't love themselves, who had no self-esteem, but they loved their kids. They really did. They did anything for their kids. Now, it may not be as healthy, it may not be as good, but I think sometimes in our society, we assume that all the good that happens in the world has to start with the self. And first you have to repair you, and you have to be fine, and then you can go out. Whereas I think that a lot of good in the world is done by unhealthy people. Really. I think there are probably a lot of aid workers who are psychologically very unhealthy, but you know what? They do a lot of good in the world. So one of the things about the meaning of life is it's sometimes divided up. We tend to think that the meaning of life is all about us, but there are people who find their meaning in being almost literally selfless. That is, in doing for others, they find the meaning of life, whereas others find the meaning of life in attaining some kind of enlightenment inside themselves. And Judaism, this will not surprise you, supports both. Granted, it's probably a little more on the side of doing for the world. The mitzvot are more about doing for the world, but the rabbis say twice in the Talmud, the only purpose of the mitzvot is rak, which means only, litzaref et habriot, to refine human nature. So it's a feedback loop in Judaism. That is, you do mitzvot, it makes you better. You do more mitzvot, it makes you better. But I do think that we have to understand that in Judaism, a lot of this is about fixing the world, even if you're not fixed. And I really feel, in some sense, that the way, when people talk about how they have to improve themselves before they can help the world, it's almost like we have to fix all our problems at home before we can give foreign aid. Which means, effectively, we will never in the history of our country give any foreign aid. Because we'll never fix all the problems at home. No country will ever fix all the problems at home. We're human beings. As soon as we fix a problem, people make more problems. That's what we do. So if you're not going to do things until everything is all right at home, that is in your soul, then basically you'll never do anything. Which means that there's a constant back and forth between helping others and trying to shore up yourself, and the way in which they both work. Okay, so let me now turn for a second to Sukkot, and then make 3 suggestions about what is a meaningful life in the Jewish tradition. Having said, as I hope you'll understand, I hope is clear, that I really believe there are a plurality of meanings of life, and that Judaism supports a plurality, which is why you get Hasidim and Mitnagdim, and you get the idea of the pious simple soul, and the idea of the great scholar, and the person who does for the world, and the person who stays home and is a Kabbalist and works on their soul, and you get all those different types because there's no single path. Okay. The one thing, and especially on Sukkot, that Rabbi Sherman actually alluded to in his introduction, is when I said one world at a time, Judaism takes death very seriously. And you can't really speak about the meaning of life without understanding the reality of death. Now, as I said several minutes ago, I'm not going to talk about Olam Haba, the world to come, for the purposes of this lecture, but the meaning of life is heightened and sharpened by the knowledge that it doesn't go on forever. If it went on forever, I mean, nothing, in some ways that drains meaning out of life, because if I say to you, I had a terrible fight with my brother, I'll make it up to him in the next century. Really, nothing is bad because you have forever. The only thing that makes things good or bad is the temporality of things, and that Judaism is very clear on from the very beginning. The first story about human beings is Adam and Eve, and the first consequence of leaving Eden is you will die. So, whatever the meaning of life is, it has to include an awareness of its finality. And that's why Jews mourn. Even though Judaism has always had a belief in Olam Haba and the world to come, the rabbis talk about it all the time, it doesn't stop anybody from crying when someone dies. So we're split in this idea. Yes, we take comfort from the idea that people move on, but death is really bad. And it's one of the reasons, by the way, the reality of that and the finality of that is one of the reasons why Judaism has such a powerful and long medical history. That is, even in the Middle Ages, just read Sherwin Nuland's short book about Maimonides, even in the Middle Ages, all the famous doctors were Jews. Why? I think at least part of the reason is that Jews really took death seriously, and they didn't, for the most part, see this as, well, this doesn't really matter because we're going on to that. So that's the prelude of the 3 things, having now talked about all the things that life isn't meaningful about. I want to suggest 3 that it is, or 5, depending on how you slice it. The first is the very first thing that God says about human nature in the Torah, the very first thing, and also the first thing that is called not good. Lo tov hayot adam levado. It's not good for a human being to be alone. aloneness, or loneliness better, is the first thing that's called not good in the whole Torah. And it's clear, and everybody knows this, that part of the meaning of life are both intimate and extended connections. Both. Not just intimate connections, but intimate and extended connections, and that we all are an interconnected web, and that we really we are dependent on one another. And that's just, I heard the story this morning, in fact, of a man who fled during the Second World War from Czechoslovakia, and his parents said the Jewish community of Hungary, which had yet not been invaded, it wasn't until 1944, the Jewish community of Hungary will take care of you. And he said, how do you know, or where are they? And they said, we don't know, just go. And he went, and they did. And so that's part of the meaning of life, is that interconnection, not only of people who are close to you, but people who, everybody who has ever been sick, for example, has discovered a network of remarkable people who all of a sudden become very intimate very quickly with you, and you didn't even, and yesterday you didn't know they lived. So that's got to be a piece of it, is your connections, and this is, this is love in many, many different forms. But as I said, part of the problem with the word love is it's so elastic. And it's applied to so much that to call the meaning of life love is like saying the meaning of life is life. In other words, it doesn't help me narrow it down at all. The second part of this is one of the psalmists writes, Lo amut ki ehyeh, I will not die but live. To which obviously the commentators say, well, isn't that redundant? If you're not dying, you're alive. And he answers his own question, which is no, you actually can sleepwalk through life. You can do a lot of stuff on automatic pilot and never really be aware. So when I said before about the man who says, gee, I wish I spent more time with my children, I think that's what he's really saying. He's saying, I sort of was on automatic pilot and I didn't really feel what mattered to me at the time. Now, as I said, I don't know if you made him 35 again, how he would react, or she, but the very asking yourself, what is the meaning of life, that question alone produces some awakeness. I felt it myself. Once Carrie asked me, and I said, I got to think about this. What do I think is the meaning of life? Yeah, I think about these kinds of things all the time, but do I really think what the meaning of life is? I remember years ago, I wrote a small book called Why Be Jewish? And I said the meaning of life in the Jewish tradition is to grow in soul, which I believe, but again, big definition, not so helpful. Because you can grow in soul in innumerable ways, so that's not great. It's great, but it's not. But to revisit the question and to ask yourself, that's why each morning in the tefillot, it says, Ma anachnu, ma chayenu, ma tzidkenu, ma gvuratenu. What is our life? What is our goodness? What is our strength? How do we come before you, God? In other words, you've got to ask yourself those questions, and if you really ask them, it wakes you up. Because then you have to think, so what do I really care about? What matters to me? Now I want to say something about automatic pilot because I don't want to speak against it. If I said to you, you were going to die tomorrow, my guess is you would not spend tonight watching the DVR of Homeland that you take on Sunday, right? Which was a double episode. An hour and 45 minutes of very fine viewing. But you can't live all the time as if you're going to die tomorrow. And I don't even think that it's healthy to do that. There's a balance here. Another thing that people say life is about balance, but again, not so helpful. There's a balance here, which is, yeah, it's true. If I knew I was going to die tomorrow, and I remember, I'll give my own example. When I was diagnosed and I had chemo, So I started off being like very keenly aware of everything in the world, and but at a certain point when this goes on for 6 months, you can't be like loving of the world at every minute, especially because you feel lousy. And it was actually in those months that I became a football fan again. Because it was something that completely took me out of myself. It was violent, which I loved, because I felt violence going on inside of me, and it was the externalization of what I was already feeling. And because you could sit on the couch and have a reason. I was sitting on the couch anyway, but I said, hey, I'm watching the game, And so if you had said to me, but how, you don't know if you're going to live, how could you spend your time watching football? I would have said, I can't spend all my time in like deep meditation and telling everybody I love how much I love them. First of all, drive them crazy. But also because a lot of life is, in fact, choosing how to fill your time engagingly, entertainingly, and non-destructively. That's a lot of life. Now, is that the meaning of life? No, but if you say that isn't part of life's meaning, then what you're saying is 40% of my life, or whatever amount of time it is not part of life's meaning. And it is. So being awake is really important to the extent that we can be awake, but I don't think anyone's awake, or at least not in our society. There may be some, great tzaddik somewhere and some yogi on a mountain who are awake all the time, but I'm mildly dubious. I'm not sure, in other words. So the first is your connections. The second is awakeness to life. And then the third, I would say, is the exercise of your powers. And by the exercise of your powers, I mean doing what you do well and take pleasure in and makes you feel affirmed, like you have a reason in this world, that you can do this. That's a very powerful thing. It's why people feel such satisfaction in things like work, parenting, artistic endeavors, scientific or technical endeavors, all the things that people are good at when you create something and you feel like, wow, that's, I did that, or I can do that. Or a child comes to you and you give them a good question, a good answer as a parent, and they walk away and you think, yeah, that's part of the meaning of life, is to be able to exercise your gifts in a way that, the psychologists talk about flow. This idea of flow. That is when you feel that instead of doing something, that things are being done through you. And that's a beautiful and a wonderful thing, and that's clearly, I think, part of the meaning of life for most people. Intimate connections, being alert to what life is, and being able to exercise the powers that God gave you. And then I would end up with two more things in my list of 5 meanings of life. One is exactly growing your soul, but growing your soul in the sense of becoming a deeper, wiser, kinder, fuller human being. Which is really, and in here, I actually don't think that this is just pap. This is what we talk about on Yom Kippur, which is like saying to yourself, I know I do this, I know I'm better than this, I can be better in the year to come. That's part of the meaning too, is you're supposed to return your soul with some improvements, not worse than you got it. And everybody who has ever in their life sinned and done tshuva, of whatever kind, for whatever reason, they know that, there are times when you really feel like your soul is stained, and you really feel at other times like your soul has been cleansed. And that's got to be part of the meaning of life, is the care that you take of your own soul. And then lastly, and then I'll just recap the 5, lastly, improving the world. That is the meaning of life surely in the Jewish tradition. I hate to use the phrase tikkun olam just because it's so tremendously overused and not always correctly used, but let's just talk about making God's world better, which means everything from helping other human beings, which is the primary thing, to helping the world in general, to taking care of all living things, or taking care of the environment, or taking care of whatever it is that the world offers you that you have a choice of destroying or making better. And that clearly has to be part of the meaning. And all of these 5 things, they all interpenetrate. That is, they all have to do one with the other. Improving your soul and your intimate connections and being awake and making the world better and exercising your powers, it's not as though they're 5 discrete things, because we may have different abilities and so on, but we're more or less integrated people. We all come in a single package. So it's not as though I'm talking about things that have nothing to do with one another, but I do think that in some sense, all of them are both broad enough and specific enough to really constitute part of the meaning of life. And if you think about your own life, I think you'll see that all of them have places in your life that actually make a difference. Now, having said all of that, let me just close by saying this, which is that the other part of the meaning of life are the stages of life. And different things will matter differently at different times. If you want to see a beautiful illustration of this, read Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, where he goes back to nature and he remembers the incredible passion with which he loved nature when he was young. And he can't love it the same way now. He's now returning as an older man. And he still loves nature, but he says, I cannot paint what then I was. It's different now. And so the meanings of life, they're going to change over the course of life. And that's part of the wisdom of getting older, is allowing the stages of younger to be what they are and not resenting them. It's too commonly older people want younger people to be older people, because they are. But we weren't. And so that's part of it too, is I think you have to, part of the meaning of life is to be where you are. Whatever that means, and it's different for every person, and it has different implications and so on. But this comes back to exactly what Carrie started out with, which is that the questions in this case are sometimes deeper and more productive than the answers, and the journey infinitely more interesting than the destination, especially because life has no destination unless it's the grave. And that finally, I suppose, would be something that's worth emphasizing at the end. And that is that all through life, we all make them, I don't know if it's a mistake, but we all repeat the assumption that if something happens, things will be all right. And we can't escape that. It must be built somehow into our DNA, right? If I would just, and it doesn't matter what it is, make more money, retire, get this, have this kid do that, have this one, and the truth of life is that it is a constant problem-creating machine, right? And that nothing, I don't care what you wish for, none of it will eliminate the problems of being alive. It may make things, I'm not saying that it won't be easier or harder, but part of the meaning of life has got to be the constant confrontation with the challenges of life. Or this is very badly designed, because there are always challenges, always. And sometimes they're worse and sometimes they're better, but they're always there. And so I guess I will close. I've told this story a million times, and most of you, maybe all of you know it. But, and I didn't actually know that I was going to close on it, but it's such a good story. It really is such a good story, and it fits this so well that I'm going to tell it anyway. So it's about a rich man who has a beautiful daughter, and he wants to marry her off. And so he goes, this is a couple of hundred years ago in Eastern Europe. What do? You want to find the greatest scholar. That's who should marry your daughter. Not so much today, but then. Today, you just imagine I'm going to Harvard, I'm going to find the best student, that's going to marry my daughter. So he goes to the big yeshiva, and he says to the heads of the yeshiva, look, I have this beautiful daughter, I'm a very rich man. I'm going to propose a difficult Talmudic problem, and whichever student can answer this problem is going to marry my daughter. They said, fine. He gets up in front of the students and he tells them, the first day, 1,000 students try to answer, none of them get it right. Second day, 500 students come and answer, and none of them get it right. It goes on and on and on. Last day, there are 3 students. First one comes up and proposes an answer. He says, no, that's not it. I'm sorry. You're not worthy to marry my daughter. Second one comes up, gives an answer, says, no, you didn't get it either. Not you. Third one comes up and gives an answer. He goes, no, I'm sorry. There is nobody in this yeshiva that is worth marrying my daughter. Gets in his big coach, tells the coachman to go away. Coach starts to go away, and the third student who got it wrong comes running after the coach and yelling for him to stop. So he tells the coachman to stop. He opens the shade to the coach, and the student comes up breathless, and he says, did you figure it out? Do you have the answer? And the student says, no, I don't have the answer, but before you go, I have to know what the answer is. And he says, you are the one who marries my daughter. The point is that search, that's the meaning. And it actually wasn't about the answer. And I don't even know if that question was real or if it had an answer. But the one who couldn't stand being without an answer, even if he never got one, he's the one that had the meaning. Thank you. One, two. Bob first.
Which of your 5 answers wouldn't fit under the umbrella of struggling with our narcissism?
Which of my 5 answers wouldn't fit under the umbrella of struggling with our narcissism? I suppose improving the world. No?
Yeah.
Does that making the world better? That's not narcissistic, is it?
No, I'm saying all of them fit.
Oh.
Fit.
Oh, I see.
Into fighting our narcissism?
Is it fighting our narcissism? I don't know if improving your soul is. And also, let me say that I think that the question of self-love is a really complicated question, because a lot comes out of self-love that is beautiful. And I don't know, for example, I mean, who is more animated by self-love than someone like Picasso? Who was, by any definition, a sort of raging narcissist, but created masterworks of art, and had apparently a very deep empathy that allowed him to do it, which is weird because you don't think of that as narcissism. So, I don't know. I would say I'm hard-pressed to tease out what is in our interest and what is not. I remember when we were kids, people loved to say, you know, there's no such thing as a selfless act, because if you do something selfless, it's because you wanted to. So it's really selfish. So I don't know what, I would say struggling with our narcissism to the extent that it concerns only us and we have no projection beyond ourselves, it's narcissistic. But if I may quote Emerson, even though he used a word that we probably would not use today, he was talking about benefactors, giving money to institutions, and he said, if you eliminate ego, you castrate the benefactor. In other words, you won't get any money if you do. That, yes, Emerson lived in a different age and used different language than we do. But the point is that it's very hard to figure out where legitimate self-interest stops and narcissistic self-love predominates.
Thank you, Rabbi. As always, what you said is very meaningful. But I was wondering, is what you said the answer to the question, what makes life meaningful, as opposed to what is the meaning of life, and whether these two questions are the same.
Whether the two questions are the same, what makes life meaningful, as opposed to what is the meaning of life. I think that let me say that they're at least first cousins, those questions. I don't know if they're identical. I don't know if they're exactly kin, but and I would say the meaning of life is to live it in a way that is meaningful. So I tried to say what things make life meaningful for us, which I assume is part of the meaning. I mean, you could say the meaning. I think every answer to what is the meaning of life tends to be very, very general. So general as to be unhelpful. To do what God wants, or it's to love others, so that's why I tried to be somewhat more specific, because it's just, it's anybody, I mean, one of the, okay, I don't know if this is exactly an appropriate analogy, but here's one of the lessons that gets reinforced as a rabbi again and again and again, amazingly so, is how much the same arguments and the same incidents from the same two people can be used in exactly opposite ways, right? And almost every dissatisfaction that someone has begins with, but don't Jewish values say, and then the other person will say the same thing but in the opposite direction. So if you're going to be helpful, you have to try as best you can to be more specific rather than more general, because things like Jewish values or love or goodness, they're so diffuse as to be able to be used, as the old saying has, the devil can quote scripture to his purpose. So I tried to be more specific, but yes, Rosa.
Of course, death is what drives people in the sense that we want to find why were we put on this earth. And sometimes it's difficult for people to figure out what is their purpose in life. Sometimes when you have to work for a living,
right,
that's where your time goes, and maybe you cannot develop other things that your soul grows into. So I think that's something that may be in the minds of more people than just me. And so how do help people with that?
So the reality, I think the question was that the reality is that a lot of people can't find their purpose or don't have the life circumstances that allows them to find their purpose. That's why I started off with, remember when I was giving all these people who were incompatible, I started off with a tribesman searching for food. I mean, to say to him, your purpose in life is to find your passion is meaningless, because his purpose in life is to feed, is to learn how to eat. And so you could say to some extent, if you were, if you're a Marxist, you would say the meaning of life is a bourgeois question. That is, once all your economic needs are taken care of, you can talk about the meaning of life. But if you have to work, 12 hours a day for a living, then the meaning of life is what your boss tells you it is, so that you can make a living and feed yourself and your family. But even so, I have to say, here let me be a little bit chauvinistic about the Jewish tradition. Because in Eastern Europe, one of the things, if you read histories of Eastern Europe, I mean, these guys worked 12 hours a day, like everybody else in the peasant. And yet they had, the Kovno Society for the Study of Mishnah, where lumberjacks, after working all day long, would gather together with the rabbi for an hour before they went to sleep to study Mishnah. Or the Kishinev Society for Musar literature, where they would study ethical literature. I have to say, I think for Jews, even when their circumstances were terrible, and I'm not saying other people didn't, I'm just saying we did, we really never neglected deeper questions and transcendent questions. And the idea that the meaning of life was to live beyond yourself, which is another thing I could have said, but again, is a broad category. So I'm not prepared, just based on my ancestors, I'm not prepared to believe that you can't, even in the most extreme circumstances, even in the camps where people would study. I mean, how do you do that? It's only if you really do believe that human beings have something more than a desperate search for food that is what existence is supposed to be. And clearly the Jewish tradition did, you know that fantastic story again, to revert to stories that I tell often, but this is such a good one, and then David, I'll take the last question. The Hugo Grin story about his father in Auschwitz who used the margarine ration to light the Hanukkah candle. And Grin, who was a child at the time, who later became a very well-known rabbi in England, said, "What are you doing? This is our food." And his father said, "We've learned in the camps that you can live for 3 weeks without food, for 3 days without water, but not for 3 minutes without hope." Now that's somebody who, in the worst circumstances, still thought that there were things that were greater than just eating. And that's a remarkable thing, but people can't do it. Yeah.
Well, as you know, I took some Kabbalah.
David said, as you know, I took some Kabbalah. I just want to repeat it so people can hear it.
And their theory is that you have to find the reason why you were put on this earth.
Right. Oh, I'm so glad you said that, because I so want to disagree with it.
And when I mentioned this to you, you said it was snake.
Yes. Right. Okay, so David said their theory is, the Kabbalist theory is, you have to find the reason why you were put on this earth. He said, and when I mentioned it to you, you said it was snake oil. Let me clarify this dismissive comment. I don't think I quite said that to that exact. I know what I said with snake oil. It wasn't exactly the idea that you find your purpose. Because here's what I would say. I don't believe that your purpose is something that you find. I think it's something that you find and that you make. And the idea that there is some purpose out there that's just waiting for you, and you're, great, you found it, which suggests that you have a unitrack soul, only one way you can go, violates everything I know about people. I know people who've had like several different lives, and all of them were meaningful and rich and beautiful and so on. And are you going to say that only one of them was their purpose? Or retroactively, yeah, actually they found all their purposes. I don't believe it. I remember when I got sick, people would say to me, "Why do you think God gave you cancer?" Like, what was the meaning? And I thought and they meant it perfectly. I mean, I understood what they meant. I didn't resent people asking it. But I always said the same thing, which is, I really believe things happen to you, and then you have to create meaning out of them. Not that there's a preset meaning. The lymphoma meaning is this. No, but having gone through it now, what do I do that actually... So, I mean, when I saw my daughter raise money for cancer, and she said, "This is how I make what happened to my parents meaningful," I don't think that God said, "Oh, you know what? We need to raise a little money for leukemia lymphoma. I'm going to give them cancer, and then the daughter's going to come along in 15 years, or whatever." And no, I don't think so. I also think that, by the way, it removes the creative element from human beings. I mean, yeah, there are some people who it seems like it's beshert, it's fated that they did what they did. Like that story that I read, I don't know if you remember, I read over the high holidays about Louis Armstrong, where he shot off a gun on New Year's, and they took him to the Colored Waifs Home for Boys in 1913, January 1st. And he was such a difficult kid that the head of the institution didn't know what to do with him, wanted to hit him, but instead he gave him a trumpet. And he took it, and he started to blow on it, and he became Louis Armstrong. And so you could say, okay, there's somebody who found his purpose. But even there, I think it's just good fortune and intuition that, in part, that the guy gave him a trumpet. It's a good thing he didn't, I don't know, he didn't give him a pencil and pen and paper. That doesn't mean he would have turned into Picasso. It's partly what we create out of what we're given. And I think that that's a beautiful thing. And the idea, and part of the reason that I say that, this is what I said with snake oil. But this is what I said with snake oil. The idea that whatever happens to you is fated to happen to you, and it's what's meant to happen to you, that's snake oil.
I didn't really mean that.
Okay?
I meant that life is full of challenges, as you correctly
Yes.
pointed out. And it's our obligation to overcome those challenges and to be happy in the knowledge that we have the power to overcome them as they're happening.
And my answer to that would be, he said that it's our obligation to overcome the challenges of life and to be happy in the knowledge that we have the power to overcome them. And my answer to that is yes, when we have the power to overcome them. But not all challenges can be overcome. And sometimes they're quite awful. And look, I will leave you, I don't know if I'll leave you with this because it's painful, but what Harold Kushner says, you know how Harold Kushner's son had progeria, I think it's called, the rapidly aging disease, and he died as an old man when he was 10 or 11, I don't remember the age. And if you remember, when Kushner was here, he said something very powerful. I don't remember if he says it in his book or not. He said, because my son died, I'm a more compassionate human being, I'm a better rabbi, I became a famous writer, and I helped many, many people. And I would give it back in a second to have my son back. So I don't believe this. I think it's a sort of Pollyannish view, I think, that you've always overcome the challenges and everything works out the way it's supposed to. I think that there's a lot of randomness in the world, and that if you're lucky enough to have time, then yes, you have an obligation to use the time that you have in all the ways that I spoke about. But the idea that you make your own luck in this world is an idea that is very popular among lucky people. And I say this as a lucky person. But I know that I didn't do anything to deserve being born in the richest country in the world and never to have gone hungry instead of being born in 1920 in Warsaw. I was just lucky. I was just lucky. And therefore, part of the meaning of life is capitalizing on the luck that you have, which is not something that I mentioned, but I'm glad I had a chance to. And finally, just to close it out, part of the meaning of life lives in the very disagreements and friction and discussion and argument that you have with other people about deep things like the meaning of life. So,
Thank you again, Rabbi. Our tradition certainly has a lot of disagreement and argument. I wanted to give you a little token to remind you about tonight. It's a book by Charles Murray. It's called The Curmudgeon's Guide to Getting Ahead. Do's and don'ts of right behavior, tough thinking, clear writing, and living a good life, including a chapter on the pursuit of happiness. It's just a wonderful, wonderful little gem. Thank you. Thank you. If I could have your attention for maybe just 5-6 more minutes, then